The rain drummed against the metal roof of the animal sanctuary as Sarah made her evening rounds. The converted warehouse on the outskirts of New Geneva housed dozens of creatures from across the galaxy, each one abandoned, injured, or simply unwanted by their original owners. Sarah had been running the shelter for 3 years now, ever since the Galactic Council had established permanent trade relations with Earth. Tonight felt different, though. The usual symphony of chirps, growls, and mechanical whirring from the various alien pets seemed more subdued. Even Zephyr, the normally boisterous cloud dancer, floated listlessly in his atmospheric tank. Sarah paused at the isolation ward, her breath fogging in the cooler air. Behind the reinforced transparent aluminum barrier sat the reason for everyone's unease. The creature was about the size of a large house cat, but that's where any resemblance to Earth felines ended. Its fur was a deep obsidian black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 6 limbs ended in retractable claws that could slice through most metals, and its face bore 3 eyes arranged in a triangle, each one glowing with an eerie amber light. This was a shadow cat, and according to every galactic database, it was the most dangerous pet species known to civilized space. The creature had arrived 2 weeks ago in a shipping container marked only with a station return address. No note, no explanation, just the animal and a basic containment unit that was already failing when it reached the shelter. Most facilities would have called for immediate. The Galactic Pet Registry listed shadow cats as Class X entities, banned from ownership by any species except their native. But Sarah wasn't most people. She had spent hours researching everything available about the species. The files painted a terrifying picture. Shadow cats were described as psychically aggressive, capable of inducing nightmares and paranoia in other species. Their claws secreted a neurotoxin that could cause permanent nerve damage. Most disturbing of all, they were said to be empathically parasitic, feeding on the fear and negative emotions of creatures around them. Every rational part of Sarah's mind told her to follow protocol. Call the authorities, have the animal removed, protect the other creatures in her care. But something about the shadow cat bothered her. In all the hours she'd observed it, the creature had never once shown aggression. It sat quietly in the corner of its enclosure, those 3 amber eyes watching her with what seemed like profound sadness. The shelter's other volunteers had refused to work the night shifts since the shadow cat arrived. Even her most experienced handler, who had worked with acid spitters and vegan mindworms, claimed the creature gave him splitting headaches and terrible dreams. Sarah pulled on her protective gloves and entered the isolation chamber's outer airlock. The shadow cat's head turned toward her, all 3 eyes focusing with laser intensity. She felt the familiar pressure behind her temples that everyone complained about, but she had learned to push through it. "Hey there, beautiful," she whispered, settling onto the floor just outside the creature's reach. "How are you feeling today?" The shadow cat tilted its head, a gesture so reminiscent of Earth cats that Sarah almost smiled. She had been visiting like this every day for 2 weeks, talking to the creature, trying to understand why it seemed so different from the terrifying descriptions in the databases. From her jacket pocket, she pulled out a small piece of synthesized protein that she had specially ordered. The dietary requirements were complex, but Sarah had managed to replicate something close to their natural food sources. The shadow cat's nostrils flared, and for the first time since its arrival, it moved. Slowly, carefully, the creature approached the barrier between them. Sarah placed the food in the feeding slot and watched as delicate black paws reached through to accept it. The moment their skin made contact through the protective material, Sarah gasped. Images flooded her mind, not the violent, disturbing visions she had expected, but something else entirely. She saw the shadow cat as a kitten playing with others of its kind in what looked like a vast crystal cave. She felt warmth, safety, belonging. Then the images shifted, becoming darker. She saw cages, bright lights, creatures in white coats conducting experiments. Fear, pain, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. The connection lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Sarah understood. This wasn't a monster. This was a traumatized animal that had been subjected to terrible experiences and then discarded when it no longer served its purpose. "Oh, you poor thing," Sarah murmured, her eyes filling with tears. "No wonder you're so scared." The shadow cat stepped back, its 3 eyes wide with what looked like surprise. It had clearly not expected such a reaction. Most species that made accidental psychic contact with experienced their own fears reflected and amplified. But Sarah had felt the creature's pain, not her own terror. Over the following days, Sarah began spending more time with the shadow cat. She learned that the psychic pressure others felt wasn't actually aggression, but rather the creature's attempt to communicate in the only way it knew how. Were naturally telepathic, and being isolated from their own kind had left this one desperate for any form of connection. She started bringing books to read aloud during her visits, discovering that the creature seemed to enjoy the sound of her voice. She noticed that the shadow cat's posture began to change, becoming less defensive and more curious. The other animals in the shelter gradually stopped showing signs of distress, though none of the other volunteers were willing to work directly with the isolation ward. 3 weeks after the shadow cat's arrival, Sarah made a decision that would have shocked the entire galactic community had they known about it. She submitted an adoption application for the creature, listing herself as the adoptive parent. The bureaucratic process was a nightmare. Species Protection Services launched an immediate investigation into the shelter's operations. Representatives from 3 different galactic governments demanded explanations. The embassy itself sent a delegation to Earth, claiming that no human could possibly be qualified to care for one of their people. Because that's what Sarah had learned through her research. Shadow cats weren't pets at all. They were sapient beings, as intelligent as any member of the Galactic Council. The pet trade had been capturing and conditioning young for decades, using neural suppressors to diminish their intelligence and make them more manageable. It was one of the galaxy's most shameful open secrets, ignored because political influence was minimal and there was far from major trade routes. The shadow cat in her care wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, probably a teenager in terms, who had been kidnapped, experimented on, and abandoned when its conditioning began to wear off. Sarah sat in her small office, surrounded by legal documents and official protests, as news crews from 17 different planets gathered outside the shelter. The shadow cat, whom she had begun calling Nova, sat on a specially designed perch nearby. The neural suppression collar that had been hidden beneath its thick fur had been removed by a who specialized in anatomy. Nova's true intelligence was rapidly returning, along with its ability to communicate telepathically. The first words Nova spoke directly into Sarah's mind were simple but profound. "Thank you for seeing me." The galactic community was in uproar. Human adoption of a was unprecedented and legally questionable. Several species threatened to impose trade sanctions if Earth didn't immediately return Nova to proper authorities. The government, embarrassed by the exposure of the illegal pet trade involving their people, demanded Nova's immediate repatriation. But Sarah had made up her mind. She had seen the fear in Nova's memories, the systematic abuse and conditioning designed to break a young person's spirit. She had felt Nova's desperate gratitude at being treated with basic kindness for the first time in years. The media dubbed her the crazy cat lady of the galaxy, but Sarah didn't care. She knew that giving up now would mean Nova's return to a system that viewed as exotic commodities rather than people. The legal battle was just beginning, but Sarah was prepared to fight it. As she worked late into the night, preparing her case with a team of human rights lawyers who had agreed to represent Nova Pro, Sarah felt a familiar presence in her mind. Nova's mental voice was growing stronger each day, losing the confused static of the neural conditioning. "You know this will make you enemies," Nova communicated. "Many powerful beings profit from what was done to me and others like me." Sarah looked up from her legal briefs and met Nova's 3 amber eyes. "Let them come," she said quietly. "You're not going back to that life, not while I'm breathing." Nova's response came not in words, but in a warm feeling of gratitude and something else Sarah was just beginning to recognize: hope. For the first time since its capture as a kit, Nova was beginning to believe that freedom might actually be possible. Outside, the protesters chanted, and the news crews recorded their reports. But inside the small shelter office, a human and a worked together, preparing for a fight that would shake the foundations of galactic society. The Galactic Court of Justice on Station Omega-7 had never seen anything quite like the proceedings that were about to unfold. Representatives from 43 different species filled the massive amphitheater, their various breathing apparatus, translation devices, and cultural accommodations creating a symphony of mechanical hums and organic sounds. At the center of it all sat 2 unlikely figures: Sarah, a human woman in a simple black suit, and Nova, the whose case had sparked the biggest diplomatic crisis in decades. 6 months had passed since Sarah's adoption application had gone public. What had started as a local news story about an unusual pet adoption had exploded into a galactic scandal when investigative journalists began uncovering the full scope of the trafficking operation. Dozens of other young had been found in private collections across the galaxy, all of them subjected to neural conditioning to suppress their natural intelligence and telepathic abilities. Sarah had become the unofficial spokesperson for what the media was calling the liberation movement. Her small animal shelter had been transformed into a rehabilitation center for recovered trafficking victims, funded by donations from sympathetic beings across the galaxy. But the legal question at the heart of it all remained unresolved. Did humans have the right to grant asylum to sentient beings from other species? The prosecution was led by Magistrate Kel 9, a crystalline entity from the Silicate Confederation. Its arguments were coldly logical and legally sound. Under current galactic law, interspecies adoption was only permitted between species that had signed specific bilateral agreements. Humans had no such treaty. Furthermore, the government officially considered Nova to be a stolen cultural artifact, not a refugee deserving protection. The human defendant has violated 17 separate statutes governing interspecies relations, Kel 9's translated voice echoed through the chamber. Regardless of her stated intentions, she has committed acts that threaten the stability of established diplomatic relationships. The government's rights must be respected. Sarah's legal team was led by Dr., one of Earth's most respected interstellar rights advocates. Her strategy was risky but necessary. Prove that Nova was not property to be returned, but a person whose rights superseded diplomatic convenience. Your Honors, Doctor addressed the three-judge panel, we are not here to debate the technicalities of adoption law. We are here to determine whether a sentient being has the right to choose their own fate, or whether they can be treated as property to be traded between governments. The first major breakthrough came when Doctor called Nova to testify. The sight of a speaking directly to the court through telepathic translation sent shockwaves through the assembly. Many species had never heard a speak as an individual rather than through diplomatic channels. Nova's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. Through the court's telepathic interface, every being in the chamber experienced fragments of Nova's memories. The terror of capture, the pain of neural conditioning, the years of isolation and confusion as their natural intelligence was systematically suppressed. I was 5 years old when they took me. Nova's mental voice reached every mind in the courtroom. I do not remember my original name. I do not remember my family. For 7 years, I believed I was an animal because that is what they made me believe. Sarah was the first being to see me as a person. The emotional impact was profound, but the prosecution quickly objected. The court cannot allow emotional manipulation to override legal precedent, Magistrate argued. If we permit unilateral species intervention based on subjective claims of mistreatment, we invite chaos. The legal battle continued for weeks. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted, giving interviews to galactic news networks and addressing crowds of protesters both for and against her cause. The human government initially tried to distance itself from the case, fearing trade repercussions, but public opinion on Earth strongly supported Sarah's actions. The turning point came from an unexpected source. During the third week of testimony, a message was received by the court from deep space. It was from the Liberation Front, a group that had previously been considered mythical by most galactic intelligence agencies. We speak for the true people, the message began, transmitted through quantum encryption that proved its authenticity. The government that claims to represent us has been corrupted by those who profit from the suffering of our children. We recognize Sarah as a protector of rights and request the court grant her full custody of the young one called Nova. The message went on to reveal evidence of systematic corruption within the government, showing how officials had been bribed by trafficking organizations to look the other way. Documents indicated that over 3,000 young had been taken from their families over the past century, with government officials receiving substantial payments for each missing kit. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The official delegation immediately denounced the message as terrorist propaganda, but forensic analysis confirmed its authenticity. Doctors seized the moment to introduce testimony from other recovered who had been found in various parts of the galaxy. One by one, they told their stories. Each account followed a similar pattern, capture as children, neural conditioning to suppress their intelligence, years of servitude as exotic pets for wealthy collectors. Some had been physically modified to be more appealing to their owners. Others had been subjected to experimental procedures designed to enhance their telepathic abilities for entertainment purposes. Sarah listened to each testimony with growing horror and determination. She had thought Nova's case was isolated, but the scale of the trafficking operation was staggering. During breaks in the proceedings, she worked with galactic law enforcement agencies to coordinate raids on suspected trafficking facilities. The human media began referring to Sarah as the Liberator, a title she found embarrassing but couldn't escape. More importantly, her actions had inspired similar rescue efforts across the galaxy. Volunteer organizations began forming on dozens of worlds, dedicated to finding and rehabilitating trafficked. Nova, meanwhile, was undergoing a remarkable transformation. As the neural conditioning continued to fade, their natural abilities began to reassert themselves. Sarah learned were not just telepathic but possessed unique abilities to sense and manipulate quantum fields. In their natural state, they were living probability engines, capable of calculating complex scenarios and predicting likely outcomes with startling accuracy. The trafficking operation will collapse within 18 months, Nova told Sarah during one of their evening conversations at the rehabilitation center. I can see the probability cascades forming. Too many people know the truth now. The economic model is no longer sustainable. Nova's predictions proved remarkably accurate. Even as the court proceedings continued, reports came in of trafficking rings being exposed across the galaxy. Several major collectors were arrested, their private menageries raided by law enforcement teams. The market for exotic pets began to dry up as insurance companies refused to cover trafficking-related losses. But the legal case was far from over. The prosecution had shifted strategies, arguing that regardless of the trafficking revelations, allowing unilateral species intervention would set a dangerous precedent. What would stop other species from liberating beings they claimed were being mistreated? It was Nova who provided the answer to this challenge. During their final testimony, they addressed the court directly, without translation or technological assistance, using a form of quantum telepathy that allowed every being present to understand their words regardless of species or language barriers. The question before this court is not about law, Nova said, their mental voice resonating with harmonics that touched something deep in every consciousness present. It is about the fundamental nature of personhood itself. You ask what gives humans the right to intervene on our behalf. I ask instead, what gives any government the right to treat its people as commodities? Nova continued, their words carrying weight that transcended mere argument. Sarah did not adopt me as a pet. She recognized me as a person and offered me protection when my own government had failed to do so. The question is not whether she had the legal right to do this, but whether I have the fundamental right to choose who protects me when my own people cannot or will not. The courtroom fell silent as Nova's words sank in. For the first time in galactic legal history, a case was being decided not on diplomatic precedent or treaties, but on the basic question of individual rights versus governmental authority. The judges deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, Chief Justice Tar of the Federation spoke for the panel. This case has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of rights and representation in galactic society, the Chief Justice began. While we recognize the sovereignty of individual governments, we cannot ignore the fundamental principle that no government has the right to treat sentient beings as property. The verdict was historic. Nova was granted full legal personhood under galactic law and the right to choose their own guardian. Sarah's adoption was recognized as legitimate, establishing the precedent that individual rights could supersede governmental claims when evidence of systematic abuse was present. But the victory came with a price. As they left the courtroom, Sarah noticed the subtle signs of increased security around them. Nova's quantum senses detected probability threads that concerned them deeply. We have won the battle, Nova told Sarah as they boarded the transport back to Earth. But I sense that the war is just beginning. There are those who have lost significant profits because of our actions, and they will not accept this defeat quietly. Sarah nodded grimly. She had received anonymous death threats and noticed suspicious surveillance around the rehabilitation center. But looking at Nova, whose three amber eyes now shone with intelligence and hope rather than fear and confusion, she knew the fight had been worth it. The galaxy was changing. Other species were beginning to question their own practices regarding the treatment of non-citizens and refugees. The precedent established by Nova's case was being cited in courts across civilized space. As their ship entered Earth's atmosphere, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had accomplished something remarkable, but Nova was right. This was just the beginning of a much larger struggle for the rights of sentient beings everywhere. 2 years had passed since the historic court decision, and the New Geneva Rehabilitation Center had grown from a converted warehouse into a sprawling complex that housed over 200 recovered trafficking victims from 17 different species. Sarah stood in the observation deck of the facility, watching as Nova worked with a group of young who had been rescued just weeks earlier. The transformation in Nova was remarkable. They had grown into their full adult form, their obsidian fur now bearing the silver markings that indicated their role as a mind bridge among their people. Their three eyes had developed the complex pupil patterns that allowed them to see across multiple dimensions of space and time simultaneously. But the most significant change was in their confidence and purpose. "The small one with the damaged neural pathways is showing improvement," Nova reported, their mental voice now carrying the harmonious overtones of a fully mature. "Her name was Whisper of Stars before they took her. She remembers fragments now." Sarah smiled sadly as she watched Nova's patient work with the traumatized Kit. Each recovery was a victory, but also a reminder of how many more were still out there, lost in the vast network of trafficking operations that spanned the galaxy. The legal precedent from Nova's case had indeed changed everything, but not always in ways Sarah had anticipated. 17 different species had filed formal complaints with the Galactic Council, claiming that the rehabilitation center's activities constituted cultural interference. Several governments had withdrawn from cooperative agreements with Earth, fearing that humans would begin liberating other beings they deemed mistreated. But the most significant changes had come from within the trafficking networks themselves. Forced to adapt to increased scrutiny, the operations had become more sophisticated and more brutal. Instead of simply suppressing their victims' intelligence, many traffickers now used irreversible neural modifications that made recovery impossible. The stakes had grown higher, and so had the violence. Sarah's contemplation was interrupted by an urgent message from Doctor's legal office. Emergency court proceedings were being convened on Station Omega-7. The government, backed by a coalition of 12 other species, was challenging the rehabilitation center's legal status. They claimed that Earth had become a haven for stolen property and demanded immediate cessation of all rescue operations. "They're afraid," Nova said, reading the situation through their quantum senses. "The trafficking networks have deeper governmental connections than we originally understood. Our success has threatened some very powerful beings." The urgency became clear when additional intelligence arrived through Nova's connections with the Liberation Front. A major trafficking operation was planned for the following week, targeting an entire colony world. If the legal challenge succeeded in shutting down the rehabilitation center, it would send a clear message that the galactic community would not support anti-trafficking efforts. Sarah made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. Instead of simply defending the center in court, she chose to go on the offensive. Working with Nova's strategic abilities and intelligence from liberation movements across the galaxy, she organized the largest coordinated rescue operation in galactic history. The plan was audacious and completely outside any legal framework. Teams of volunteers from 37 different worlds would simultaneously raid trafficking facilities across the galaxy. The rescued victims would be brought to Earth for rehabilitation, presenting the Galactic Court with that would be impossible to ignore. "You understand the risks," Nova warned her as they finalized the plans. "If this fails, you will be branded as a criminal. The human government will have no choice but to disavow your actions." Sarah looked around at the rehabilitation center, watching beings from dozens of species working together to help those who had been brutalized by the trafficking trade. Humans worked alongside reformed merchants, engineers, and even a few progressive government officials who had secretly joined their cause. "Some things are more important than politics," Sarah replied. "If we don't act now, how many more children will disappear into this system?" The operation began at precisely 800 Galactic Standard Time. Coordinated strikes hit trafficking facilities on 43 different worlds. The results were better than anyone had dared hope. Over 800 sentient beings were recovered in the first wave, including an entire family of nobles who had been missing for 6 years. But the operation also revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Evidence recovered from the raids showed direct involvement from officials in 7 different galactic governments, including 3 members of the Galactic Council itself. The trafficking networks had grown into a shadow economy worth trillions of credits, with some entire planetary systems dependent on the slave labor of conditioned telepaths. The political earthquake was immediate. Governments fell on 4 worlds as evidence of official corruption became public. The Galactic Council was forced to convene emergency sessions as member species demanded investigations into their own officials. Several major trade agreements collapsed as species refused to deal with governments proven to be involved in trafficking. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm that dwarfed even Nova's original case. The human government, initially terrified by the diplomatic crisis, eventually chose to support her actions after seeing the overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. Earth became the unofficial capital of the growing liberation movement. But the victory came at a cost that Sarah hadn't anticipated. 3 days after the coordinated raids, Nova came to her with disturbing news from their quantum senses. "They're coming for us directly now," Nova said, their mental voice tense with concern. "The trafficking networks have decided that normal legal and political pressure isn't sufficient. I'm seeing probability cascades that suggest a direct attack on the rehabilitation center within the next week." The attack came sooner than expected. Sarah was reviewing rehabilitation reports when alarms began blaring throughout the complex. Nova appeared at her side instantly, their 3 eyes wide with urgency. 12 ships, they reported. "Mixed configuration, but I'm reading heavy weapons signatures. They're not here to arrest us, Sarah. They're here to eliminate the evidence." The battle that followed became legend in the annals of conflict. The attacking force had expected to find a helpless rehabilitation facility staffed by naive human volunteers. Instead, they encountered a complex defended by beings from across the galaxy who had personal reasons to hate the trafficking networks. Former security operatives manned defensive positions alongside ex-military humans. Engineers had modified the facility's systems to provide tactical advantages. Most surprisingly, several dozen revealed combat abilities that had been hidden from galactic knowledge for centuries. Nova's role in the defense was pivotal. Their quantum manipulation abilities allowed them to predict enemy movements and coordinate defensive responses with unprecedented precision. But it was their revelation of true capabilities that shocked even Sarah. "Your databases were wrong about us," Nova explained as they used their mental powers to disable entire ships' worth of attackers. "We allowed the galaxy to believe we were weak telepaths suitable only for exploitation. The truth is that mature are among the most powerful psychic beings in known space." The battle lasted only 47 minutes, but its implications reverberated across the galaxy. The attacking force was completely neutralized, with several ships disabled by technologies that galactic science couldn't explain. More importantly, the entire engagement was broadcast live across the galactic communication networks, showing beings everywhere exactly what the trafficking victims were capable of when allowed to develop their natural abilities. The political aftermath was swift and decisive. Public opinion across the galaxy turned overwhelmingly against the trafficking networks and their governmental supporters. The Galactic Council voted to establish a permanent anti-trafficking enforcement division with unprecedented authority to cross governmental boundaries in pursuit of trafficking operations. Sarah's Rehabilitation Center was granted official recognition as a neutral territory under galactic law, similar to embassy status. More importantly, the Nova precedent was intergalactic legal code, establishing the principle that individual rights could supersede governmental authority in cases of systematic abuse. But for Sarah, the most meaningful change was personal. As she stood in the memorial garden that had been built to honor trafficking victims who hadn't survived to see their liberation, Nova approached with news that would reshape both their lives. "I've received communication from the True," Nova said, their mental voice carrying emotions too complex for translation. They want to meet the human who started the liberation movement. They're offering to make you an honorary member of our species, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Accepting would mean leaving Earth permanently, joining Nova in their native realm where space and time operated according to different physical laws. It would mean abandoning the rehabilitation center she had built and the life she had known. "What would that mean for the work here?" she asked. Nova's response carried warmth and pride. "The work here will continue. We've trained hundreds of beings from dozens of species to carry on what you started. But there are other trafficking networks operating in dimensions that normal law enforcement can't reach. They need someone who understands both the practical aspects of rescue operations and the legal frameworks necessary to make the results permanent." Sarah looked around the facility one last time. The rehabilitation center buzzed with activity as beings from across the galaxy worked together to heal the wounds left by systematic exploitation. Young played in specially designed quantum gardens while their minds recovered from neural conditioning. Humans worked alongside aliens in ways that had been unimaginable just 3 years earlier. "Will I still be me?" she asked, thinking of the dimensional modifications that would be necessary for her to survive in space. Nova's answer came not in words, but in a flood of shared consciousness that showed Sarah exactly what she would become. Enhanced perception that could see across multiple dimensions. Mental abilities that would allow her to communicate directly with any sentient being. Access to quantum manipulation powers that would make her one of the most capable rescue operatives in the galaxy. But underneath all the enhancements, she would still be fundamentally human. The compassion that had driven her to help Nova in the first place would remain unchanged, simply given greater scope and power. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the deep space station that served as headquarters for the Liberation Coalition. Through the viewport, she could see task force ships from 17 different species preparing for coordinated raids on trafficking facilities in the Andromeda galaxy. Her transformation into a human hybrid had been successful beyond all expectations. Her new abilities allowed her to coordinate rescue operations across vast distances and multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. More importantly, her unique perspective as both a human and an honorary had opened diplomatic channels that had been closed for centuries. Nova appeared beside her, no longer her adopted charge but her equal partner in leading the liberation movement. Together, they had expanded operations beyond simple rescue missions to include systematic dismantling of the economic and political structures that made trafficking profitable. The Andromeda operations should recover approximately 3,000 beings across 47 worlds, Nova reported. Intelligence suggests we'll also be able to capture several high-ranking network administrators. Sarah nodded, her enhanced perception already calculating the political ramifications of the upcoming operation. But she also felt a deeper satisfaction in knowing that 3,000 individuals would soon experience the same freedom that Nova had found in a small animal shelter on Earth. The galaxy had changed dramatically in the years since she first decided to help an unwanted alien cat. Trafficking networks still existed, but they operated in constant fear of discovery. More importantly, the concept of individual rights had been strengthened across hundreds of worlds, and beings everywhere knew that help was available for those trapped by systematic abuse. As the task force ships disappeared into hyperspace, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had started with simple compassion for a frightened creature in a cage, but it had grown into something that reshaped galactic civilization itself. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if someone else had been working at the shelter that night?" Nova asked, reading her thoughts. Sarah smiled, her 3 human eyes and 1 sensory organ giving her a perspective that no being in galactic history had ever possessed. "I don't think it matters," she replied. "Someone would have helped you eventually. The real question is whether they would have been stubborn enough to start a revolution." Nova's response was a wave of warm amusement that rippled through the quantum field around them. "That," they said, "is what makes humans so remarkable. You don't just help individuals. You change entire systems to make sure the help isn't needed again." As they prepared for the next phase of their mission, Sarah realized that this was perhaps humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization. Not their technology or their military might, but their stubborn refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable. They saw problems and fixed them, even when the fixing required changing the fundamental nature of how civilizations operated. The little shadow cat that no one wanted had indeed changed everything. But in the end, it hadn't been magic or special powers that made the difference. It had been one human's decision to look beyond fear and see the person trapped inside the monster everyone else believed in. That simple act of recognition had cascaded across the galaxy, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness can reshape the universe itself.